At exactly 2 in the morning, a masked figure steps onto a brightly lit porch stairs. When the local affiliates first broke the news, the details were agonizingly sparse. This is not a teenager looking for an unlocked door or a transient individual seeking temporary shelter. The figure captured on the camera is fully masked, effectively concealing all identifying facial features from the digital recording. Furthermore, the individual is visibly armed, confirming that the capacity for lethal violence was present from the very first second of the encounter. This suspect approaches the doorbell camera with an unnerving calmness and purposefully disables the surveillance feed, plunging the digital record into complete darkness. The sheer efficiency of this single action completely destroys the theory of a spontaneous burglary. But the single most terrifying aspect of this footage is not just the masked man himself. It is what his presence inherently implies about the broader logistics of this crime. According to former detectives and tactical analysts who have thoroughly reviewed the known parameters of the case extracting an 84-year-old woman from a secured residential fortress is not a one-man operation. It is a complex logistical nightmare that requires extensive coordination and dedicated manpower. A prominent television host's mother goes missing from her own home, and yet the usual flurry of press conferences and immediate public appeals are suspiciously absent. To execute an abduction of this magnitude without leaving an immediate glaring trail requires a highly organized team consisting of at least 2 to 4 deeply committed individuals. Every single role in this dark operation had to be perfectly synchronized. You need someone actively disabling the perimeter security systems to blind the cameras. You need another individual positioned as a lookout to monitor the private security patrols that constantly sweep the affluent neighborhood. You need muscle to quickly and quietly overpower the victim without triggering an unmanageable commotion that would alert the neighboring estates. And most crucially, you need a dedicated driver operating a sterilized getaway vehicle ready to facilitate an immediate extraction into the sprawling Arizona desert before the local authorities can even begin to comprehend that a crime has occurred. This division of labor points directly toward a sophisticated criminal enterprise rather than a random act of suburban violence. The horrifying reality is that they successfully pulled it off. Instead, we get a doorbell video that raises infinitely more questions than it answers. Who was behind the mask? They walked into a high security zone, neutralized the digital eyes, overpowered an elderly woman of her own home, and vanished completely into the night, leaving virtually no actionable trace behind. This was an operation executed with a level of precision that strongly resembles a military strike or a professional cartel extraction. It completely reframes the entire narrative from a localized Pima County tragedy into a massive federal security crisis. The sheer scale of the organization required to pull this off successfully is staggering. This is why the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately assumed a dominant role in the active investigation, deploying massive resources to a single missing persons case. They recognized the signature of a highly capable organized threat group operating within domestic borders. This was not a robbery that went horribly wrong in the middle of the night. This was a targeted, coordinated assault executed with a chilling degree of absolute ruthless efficiency. But the most agonizing question remains completely unanswered. Why did they choose a target who was virtually guaranteed to bring the full crushing weight of federal investigators down upon them? Why would a sophisticated tactical team risk the inescapable wrath of the federal government to abduct an 84-year-old woman living quietly in retirement? What possible value does she hold to an organization capable of executing such a flawless vanishing act? If you appreciate this level of deep forensic breakdown and want to support our ongoing investigations into these complex cases, please take a second to hit the like button right now. Targeting the mother of a highly visible television personality carries monumental risks. They knew exactly who she was, and they knew exactly the kind of massive law enforcement firestorm their actions would inevitably ignite. Yet they proceeded with the operation anyway, demonstrating a terrifying level of confidence in their ability to remain hidden. The video evidence proved that a highly organized team of predators is operating with near impunity. The local police were completely outmatched from the very beginning. The game had fundamentally changed, and the investigation was about to plunge into To understand the sheer scale of this mystery, we have to look past the glaring, frustrating labyrinth of dead ends and deliberately planted false leads designed to waste precious time. The physical investigation immediately devolved into a chaotic scramble across the unforgiving Arizona landscape. Detectives were desperate to find any tangible thread that could lead them to the highly organized team captured on the doorbell camera. The initial focus, understandably, centered on the immediate vicinity of the crime scene and the scattered physical evidence left behind. However, the tangible clues quickly proved to be a maddening collection of dead ends and red herrings that only served to severely fracture the focus of the massive investigative task force. Every promising lead seemed to inevitably evaporate under intense forensic scrutiny. For instance, in the highly chaotic early days of the frantic search, a pair of gloves was discovered discarded near the perimeter of the affluent neighborhood. For a brief, hopeful moment, investigators believed they had secured a critical piece of the puzzle that might yield recoverable touch transfer DNA or point directly toward the suspected assailants. Headlines and focus on the very deliberate steps taken by the alleged perpetrators. It seemed like the first genuine breakthrough in a case totally devoid of solid answers. But after a rigorous analysis, the gloves were officially ruled out as being entirely unconnected to the violent abduction. They were simply discarded debris, a frustrating coincidence that consumed valuable hours of investigative resources. The authorities were essentially chasing shadows in the desert heat. The desperation of the search reached a fever pitch around February 11th when law enforcement executed a highly publicized raid. Acting on an undisclosed tip, heavily armed tactical units descended upon a residential location. Down in Rio Rico, Arizona, a community situated disturbingly close to the southern border. The primary target of this aggressive operation was a mail delivery driver who became an immediate person of interest. He was promptly detained by authorities and subjected to rigorous interrogation regarding his potential involvement in the disappearance. The public briefly exhaled, believing that a major suspect was finally in custody and that the walls were rapidly closing in on the organized crew. They did not stumble onto that porch by accident. However, the hope was agonizingly short-lived. After several intense hours of questioning, the delivery driver was officially released from police custody without facing any criminal charges. He vehemently maintained his absolute innocence, and the lack of an arrest indicated that the authorities simply did not possess the necessary evidence to hold him. Once again, a massive surge of police activity had resulted in a devastating return to square one. The investigation was fundamentally bleeding critical momentum. The physical trail was growing colder by the minute, and the vast expanse of the surrounding desert offered a million places to hide dark secrets. Adding to the mounting confusion, a highly disturbing detail emerged from the periphery of the official search efforts. According to the Daily Mail, a set of pajamas was reportedly discovered abandoned in a remote, desolate area a significant distance away from the original crime scene. This single, unverified piece of evidence introduced a horrifying new layer of psychological dread to the already complex narrative. The discovery immediately sparked terrifying questions about her current condition and the brutal nature of her captivity. If the clothing actually belonged to her, why was it discarded in the wilderness? The authorities immediately collected the garments and sent them off for expedited forensic testing, desperately hoping they arrived with a calculated purpose, executing a maneuver that requires a terrifying level of precision to extract microscopic fibers or biological material that could finally point them toward a definitive location. The entire community anxiously awaited the results of the laboratory analysis, praying for a miraculous break in the deeply stalled case. But as the days slowly, agonizingly turned into weeks, the physical evidence continued to lead the task force in endless, frustrating circles across the arid landscape. The local police and the federal agents were caught in a brutal war of attrition, desperately sifting through the sprawling desert for a needle in an impossibly large haystack. The suspects had successfully manipulated the physical environment, leaving behind a confusing trail of discarded items and false leads designed specifically to disorient the pursuing investigators. The authorities were spending massive amounts of energy running down irrelevant clues while the actual perpetrators remained entirely invisible. The frustration within the law enforcement community was palpable as they repeatedly hit a solid brick wall in their desperate search for tangible answers. They had the manpower and they had the immense resources of the federal government, but they lacked a clear direction. But just as the physical search seemed entirely hopelessly stalled, a completely different kind of clue emerged from the shadows. The footage shows no hesitation and no frantic searching. The perpetrators had flawlessly managed to obscure their physical movements in the real world, but they were about to make a calculated move in the digital realm. The entire focus of the investigation was about to violently shift away from the dusty trails of Arizona and pivot directly toward the dark, highly encrypted corners of the internet, where a terrifying new demand would completely alter the fundamental nature of the criminal enterprise. The landscape of the investigation fractures dramatically in mid-February when the agonizing silence is finally broken, not by law enforcement, but by an alleged communication from the captors themselves. Newsrooms across the country suddenly find themselves pulled directly into the center of a high-stakes hostage negotiation. A message reportedly lands in the digital inboxes of major media syndicates demanding an astronomical sum for the safe return of the captive. The price tag attached to this human life is a staggering $6 million. But this is not a traditional demand for unmarked, non-sequential bills left in a duffel bag at a remote drop site. The perpetrators demand the entire sum be transferred exclusively through cryptocurrency. Specifically, utilizing a decentralized digital ledger system designed to permanently obscure their financial trail. There is just a cold, methodical neutralization of the only eye that could have watched them. And then there is the immediate aftermath. This alleged ransom note introduces a terrifying modern complication to the already unbearable weight. It forces the investigative teams to completely pivot their primary strategies from physically sweeping the arid wastelands of the Southwest to aggressively scrutinizing highly complex global blockchain transactions. Cyber analysts immediately begin monitoring the provided digital wallet addresses, and soon disturbing whispers emerge within the intelligence community that minor fractional transactions are actively occurring on the ledger. These microscopic movements of digital currency strongly suggest that the sophisticated network behind the abduction is alive and carefully testing the plumbing of their international financial escape route before demanding the massive main deposit. However, the federal authorities absolutely refuse to officially validate the authenticity of these demands or acknowledge the existence of the digital wallet. This rigid refusal to confirm or deny the existence of a credible extortion threat plunges the surrounding community into an absolute frenzy of speculation and mounting anger. The epicenter of this intense public outrage firmly targets the leadership of the local jurisdiction, directly into a security lens, and raises a weapon. The feed cuts to pitch black. The local police arrive, the federal agents swarm the property, and suddenly, an invisible wall of silence drops around the entire Catalina Foothills area. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos finds himself standing completely exposed at the center of a devastating political firestorm. The community violently demands answers. They demand immediate reassurance, and they demand to know exactly why a covert operation of this magnitude could successfully occur under his direct watch without a single tangible update provided to the terrified public. Vocal critics aggressively condemn his department for an unprecedented and dangerous lack of transparency, accusing the law enforcement leadership of intentionally withholding vital public safety information to cover up their own catastrophic systemic failures in the crucial early hours of the crisis. The press briefings are nothing but masterclasses in bureaucratic deflection, offering absolutely nothing but empty platitudes while a family waits in unimaginable agony. The terrible optics of a local sheriff seemingly paralyzed by the staggering complexity of a high-tech kidnapping, while simultaneously stonewalling the national media, creates a deeply toxic environment of widespread distrust. Terrified residents are left constantly wondering if the local police force is simply completely out of its depth, or if the administration is actively obstructing the flow of information to desperately protect their own professional reputations from the fallout. The void of information has bred wild internet theories, but the truth hidden inside the official Federal Bureau of Investigation releases is far more sinister. The pressure cooker of public opinion rapidly reaches a critical boiling point as the endless days tick by without a single official confirmation regarding any proof of life. The suffocating silence from the sheriff's department becomes almost as oppressive and frightening as the crime itself. What is your take on the way the local sheriff has handled the critical flow of information to the public during this unprecedented crisis? Because the comment section down below is open, and we really want to hear your thoughts on whether this extreme secrecy is a justified tactic or a dangerous failure of leadership. The glaring disconnect between the highly visible initial crime and the completely invisible ongoing investigation breeds a deep corrosive paranoia throughout the entire state. People begin to fundamentally question the very foundation of their community safety protocols and the competence of their elected protectors. If a highly organized tactical team can snatch a prominent senior citizen and seamlessly transition into a sophisticated global cryptocurrency extortion plot, while the local authorities remain entirely tight-lipped, then absolutely no one living in that valley is truly safe from harm. We are looking at an operation that actively defies the logic of a random crime of opportunity. This extreme tension is entirely unsustainable. The local authorities are clearly buckling under the crushing weight of relentless national scrutiny, and the digital trail of the alleged ransom money is bouncing across untraceable global servers, actively mocking the geographical limitations of county law enforcement. The entire public narrative is stretched to its absolute breaking point, waiting desperately for a definitive move from the only agency truly equipped to handle a multifaceted threat of this immense magnitude. And just when the exhausted public firmly believes the investigation has completely stalled out in a swamp of local incompetence, the true, hidden scale of the law enforcement response finally reveals itself in a massive, unmistakable display of overwhelming federal power. The turning point arrives without warning in the early days of March 2026. The quiet suburban street that had seen only sporadic local police presence is suddenly physically transformed into a militarized staging ground. Neighbors awake to find their neighborhood entirely locked down by an overwhelming surge of federal law enforcement. Dozens of unmarked black sport utility vehicles descend upon the primary residence, blocking every conceivable exit and establishing a perimeter that completely shuts out the outside world. So let us strip away the noise and reconstruct the exact sequence of events that heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical gear swarm the property, indicating a massive, definitive escalation in the operational tempo. This is not a standard welfare check, and it is certainly not a routine follow-up interview. This sudden, aggressive show of overwhelming force is the unmistakable signature of a federal agency moving to execute a highly coordinated tactical plan. The stunning arrival of these federal units instantly answers the massive, agonizing question that has plagued this case from the very first night. The complete silence from the authorities over the past few weeks was never a sign of incompetence or a symptom of a stalled investigation. It was a highly calculated, strategic blackout designed specifically to lull the perpetrators into a false sense of security. The federal agents were intentionally allowing the local sheriff to absorb the brutal brunt of the public backlash, acting as a convenient political lightning rod, while the real investigation moved entirely underground into the classified realm of federal intelligence. They were not ignoring the ransom demands or the cryptocurrency movements. They were quietly and meticulously mapping every single digital interaction, tracing the highly complex flow of digital transformed a quiet January night into an ongoing federal nightmare in the desert. Money across international borders, and actively identifying the network of servers being used to facilitate the extortion. The captors foolishly believed that by disabling a single residential camera and demanding untraceable digital currency, they had successfully outsmarted the system. They thought they were operating completely in the shadows. But in reality, their actions had merely elevated their crime from a localized state offense to a massive federal priority. By utilizing interstate communication lines to transmit a digital ransom demand, they unwittingly triggered the involvement of the most sophisticated cyber tracking apparatus on the planet. The sudden swarm of agents in early March is the physical manifestation of a trap snapping shut. Legal analysts closely monitoring the sudden surge in federal activity universally agree on what is happening behind the closed doors. The federal prosecutors are not merely collecting scattered clues anymore. They are actively consolidating a massive airtight profile of evidence to present to a secretive grand jury. They are utilizing the absolute secrecy of the grand jury process to subpoena financial records, compel witness testimony. Living in the Catalina Foothills is supposed to be the ultimate statement of absolute safety and absolute seclusion, and lock down digital evidence without ever alerting the suspects to the exact scope of the legal net closing around them. The perpetrators thought they were always one step ahead because they could not physically see the police cars in their rearview mirrors. They failed to realize that the pursuit was entirely digital and relentless. The entire landscape of the case flips in an instant. The agonizing dread of the unknown is rapidly replaced by the terrifying realization of just how massive and sprawling this criminal enterprise truly is. The deployment of this many elite federal assets to a single location confirms that the authorities have finally identified exactly who they are hunting. They have moved from the investigative phase into the active targeting phase. The sheer scale of the response suggests they are preparing to dismantle a highly organized syndicate rather than simply apprehending a few disorganized local criminals. The stakes have reached an absolute zenith. The quiet residential street is now ground zero for a massive federal takedown operation. The silence is finally broken by the roar of federal engines and the terrifying reality that the endgame is actively unfolding in real time. This is an exclusive, wealthy enclave characterized by sprawling desert estates, private gated driveways, and a highly... If you want to stay ahead of the curve on massive federal operations exactly like this one, and get the deep dives before the mainstream media catches on, make sure you are subscribed and hit that notification bell right now so you never miss a critical case update. The sudden, undeniable presence of these federal tactical teams fundamentally changes the entire psychological atmosphere of the tragedy. It is a profound realization that the initial breach of the home was merely the opening gambit in a much larger, much darker chess match. The orchestrators of this abduction believed their technological countermeasures made them untouchable. They calculated the physical risks perfectly, but they catastrophically underestimated the invisible digital retaliation they would provoke. The massive surge of federal tactical activity undoubtedly signals a critical turning point, but it does not immediately deliver the single thing everyone is desperately praying for, which is the safe physical return of the elderly captive. The harsh, unforgiving reality of a sprawling federal task force operation is that the bureaucratic wheels of justice inevitably turn at a methodical and agonizingly slow pace, even when a human life hangs precariously in the balance. Integrated network of neighborhood closed-circuit television systems designed to monitor every inch of asphalt. As the dust finally settles from the aggressive tactical raids, the surrounding community is forced to confront a psychological landscape fundamentally altered by the prolonged, secretive investigation. At this critical juncture, it becomes absolutely paramount to meticulously separate the confirmed hard forensic evidence from the chaotic, toxic swirl of viral internet speculation that has aggressively polluted the public narrative. We must explicitly and firmly reject the dangerous, baseless rumors that have run rampant across various social media platforms. There was absolutely never an unidentified, mysterious fingerprint magically found, perfectly preserved in her bedroom, pointing directly to a shadowy new suspect. That completely fabricated, sensationalized detail was nothing more than dangerous digital noise maliciously designed to passively farm online engagement at the direct expense of a real, ongoing human tragedy. We have to violently tear away those poisonous internet myths and firmly ground our understanding entirely in the officially confirmed facts. What we know with absolute certainty is that a highly organized, masked individual violently breached a heavily secure perimeter while actively brandishing a weapon. We know definitively that elite federal agencies have completely taken over the operational timeline, aggressively tracking a complex digital ransom demand across the international blockchain. For Nancy Guthrie, this fortress of modern convenience and high-end security was her quiet personal sanctuary. And we know for a fact that the initial physical clues discovered scattered throughout the harsh desert environment ultimately proved be nothing more than sophisticated physical distractions strategically planted to maliciously waste critical early investigative hours. But despite the overwhelming, terrifying display of localized federal power, the central core mystery remains completely unresolved. The actual physical location of the kidnapped victim remains entirely unknown. The federal tactical teams are undoubtedly dismantling the underlying financial network and aggressively pursuing the encrypted digital footprints. But simply tracking a cryptocurrency wallet does not automatically generate precise GPS coordinates for a hidden hostage. The massive federal intelligence machine is fundamentally built to secure absolutely airtight criminal convictions in a federal court of law. But that meticulous, slow-moving process is inherently at odds with the urgent ticking clock of an active rescue operation. Time is undeniably the absolute greatest enemy in this specific horrific scenario. For an 84-year-old woman enduring the extreme physical and deep psychological trauma of an organized violent abduction, she lived alone, maintaining a relatively low profile despite her daughter's immense fame on national television broadcasts. Every single passing hour represents a massive exponential decrease in the statistical probability of a safe, positive outcome. The organized perpetrators are fully aware of this grim biological reality, and they are ruthlessly using the inherent physical fragility of their vulnerable captive as their ultimate bargaining leverage against the government. The investigation has successfully transitioned from a blind, frantic local search into a highly targeted strategic federal hunt, but the ultimate victory remains entirely elusive. The secret grand jury may be actively preparing heavily sealed criminal indictments, and the cyber analysts might be successfully closing the digital financial loops, but the physical void left by her violent extraction remains agonizingly wide open. The terrifying, sobering reality is that we are actively watching a high-stakes, brutal collision between the slow, methodical perfection of the federal legal system and the desperate, rapid physical deterioration of an innocent human life. The federal authorities possess the massive tactical advantage and the infinite financial resources, but the captors still hold the absolute only asset that actually matters. The ultimate agonizing question that continues to haunt every single agent actively working this massive file is whether their sophisticated digital dragnet will close quickly. That silent, terrifying frame is the very last confirmed piece of evidence before an 84-year-old woman vanishes into the frigid Arizona night. But the very architecture of this neighborhood presents a glaring structural anomaly for any prospective criminal looking for an easy target, enough to bring her home safely before the ruthless, violent elements of this criminal enterprise decide she is simply no longer a valuable commodity to their dark operation. When we analytically deconstruct the operational anatomy of this modern high-profile abduction, we are immediately confronted with the terrifying paradox of contemporary smart home security systems. Society constantly places a massive amount of blind faith in digital surveillance, incorrectly assuming that the mere presence of a glowing camera lens acts as an impenetrable physical force field against malicious intent. However, this specific high-stakes case brutally exposes the fundamental flaw in that logic, because while high-definition digital lenses are incredibly proficient at passively recording the grim reality of a crime actively unfolding, they possess absolutely zero capacity to physically prevent the violence from occurring in real time. They are merely passive digital observers, entirely dependent on the actual structural integrity of physical barriers that were tragically breached in a matter of seconds. We must fully recognize that substituting solid physical reinforcement with remote digital monitoring creates a dangerously false sense of absolute personal security. Furthermore, what this case definitively teaches us about the modern anatomy of a high-profile abduction is the incredibly delicate and often deeply frustrating to deliberately target a home deep in the foothills is to willfully walk into an inescapable surveillance dragnet. balance between the basic public right to know and the absolute critical necessity of maintaining the operational integrity of a massive covert federal investigation. We inherently demand immediate, absolute transparency from our elected law enforcement officials, especially when our local community safety feels directly threatened by an invisible, highly sophisticated adversary. But in the incredibly complex tactical environment of digital ransom negotiations and international cryptocurrency, tracking extreme public transparency can actually become a lethal weapon handed directly to the perpetrators. Releasing critical, tactical, investigative data to simply calm an anxious local public simultaneously provides the criminal syndicate with the exact intelligence they need to successfully alter their escape routes and ultimately evade federal capture forever. True operational security absolutely requires total, uncompromising silence. As the massive digital manhunt continues to relentlessly unfold, our deepest thoughts and absolute strongest prayers remain entirely with the grieving Guthrie family during this unimaginably agonizing period of endless uncertainty. We continuously hope that the immense, unrelenting pressure applied by the sophisticated federal task force, every single entering vehicle is likely logged by automated license plate readers, and every street corner is observed by high-definition private cameras, ultimately shatters the terrible silence and safely returns her to the absolute peace she so deeply deserves. The devastating reality of relying solely on passive surveillance technology to protect our vulnerable homes is a truly terrifying lesson learned in the brutal Arizona desert. But while the federal authorities are currently aggressively chasing digital ghosts and highly encrypted shadows across the vast Southwest, there is another active case file that proves the exact opposite outcome. What actually happens when a robust, modern security system flawlessly captures the precise, horrifying details that a ruthless local killer desperately never wanted the outside world to see? While one camera was quickly plunged into total darkness to successfully hide a massive coordinated crime, another hidden lens on the distant East Coast remained perfectly illuminated to actively expose a monster operating in plain sight. Click the video on your screen right now to dive deep into the chilling next case file waiting inside the vault. Criminals looking for a quick, easily fenced score actively avoid areas where their every movement is meticulously recorded and immediately stored on remote cloud servers. You need to intimately understand the topography of this specific environment because it completely reframes the entire nature of the threat facing her. The person or persons who approached her house on that fateful night were not deterred by the omnipresent surveillance state. They expected it to be there and they actively planned for it. This was not a crime of passion or a sudden violent impulse born out of localized desperation. The tactical choice to strike deeply inside an area where getting caught on camera is a near statistical certainty tells us that the attackers had a profound, almost arrogant confidence in their ability to evade the digital footprint they were inevitably leaving behind. How does an elderly resident simply evaporate from a heavily fortified, affluent neighborhood, leaving behind? They understood the precise blind spots of the system. They knew exactly how the neighborhood security apparatus functioned on a technical level. And more importantly, they knew exactly how to dismantle the specific electronic defenses guarding her residence without triggering an immediate armed response. A typical home invasion relies heavily on brute speed and the element of surprise against an unprepared, vulnerable victim. This particular operation relied on a systematic clinical teardown of technological barriers before the physical breach of the doors even began. It is absolutely crucial to internalize this specific detail because it elevates the alleged perpetrators from street-level, opportunistic thugs to dangerous individuals possessing highly specialized knowledge of tactical entry and perimeter breach. We are forced to deeply consider what kind of life circumstances or deeply hidden tensions might possibly attract this caliber of organized hostility toward an 84-year-old woman living quietly in her retirement years. There are no known public feuds, no obvious financial disputes, and no erratic behavior in her. Nothing but a severed camera feed and a deafening silence from the largest law enforcement agency in the country. Daily routine that would flag her as a high-risk target for a coordinated physical extraction. She followed a wonderfully predictable, peaceful schedule within the strict confines of a community built specifically to keep the unpredictability of the outside world entirely at bay. The stark reality is that this environment was built to repel the very type of violence that visited her doorstep. The wealth and the isolation of the foothills did not insulate her from danger. Instead, those factors may have inadvertently provided the perfect quiet staging ground for a team that needed absolute privacy to execute a highly complex abduction. The existence of dozens of cameras surrounding her home and her neighbors' properties was never a true physical shield protecting her from tangible harm. Those sophisticated glass lenses merely served as a silent, unfeeling countdown system meticulously tracking the final ordinary moments of her routine life before she was forcibly pulled into the dark. The timeline of the actual incident begins to solidify on the first day of February 2026. It was a Sunday when her family officially reported her missing to the authorities. If you want the facts, not the fiction, make sure you are subscribed. The initial dispatch to the residents was likely treated as a standard welfare check, which is routine for elderly individuals who fail to answer their phones or adhere to their established communication patterns. But the moment the first responding officers stepped onto the property, the standard protocols completely disintegrated. According to the official timeline confirmed by local law enforcement, the physical state of the residents immediately indicated a severe and violent disruption. The front porch area presented the first agonizing clue. Investigators documented undeniable forensic evidence of a physical struggle right at the primary entry point. There were confirmed blood droplets staining the concrete outside the door. This single piece of physical evidence instantly escalated the situation from a routine missing persons inquiry to an active crime scene investigation. As law enforcement breached the interior of the home, the grim reality of the situation only deepened. The chaotic scene inside mirrored the violence suggested by the exterior evidence. To Seth's crime vault and hit the bell so you never miss a case file. Reports confirmed that the blood evidence was not confined to the outdoor porch area but continued into the interior living spaces of the house, indicating that the altercation breached the threshold and moved through the private sanctuary she had built for herself. The pattern of the struggle suggested a terrifying sequence of events where she was forcibly confronted and physically overpowered within her own walls. At this early stage, the local authorities from the Pima County Sheriff's Department were essentially flying blind into a rapidly escalating crisis. They were staring at a home that had been violently compromised and a resident who had vanished without a trace. The immediate questions were desperate and frantic. Where was she taken? What kind of vehicle was used to transport her? And most pressingly, who could have orchestrated such a brazen assault in an area that prides itself on impenetrable security? The initial assumption for many veteran officers walking into a scene like this is often a burglary that escalated into an unplanned, violent confrontation when the homeowner unexpectedly interrupted the intruders. The abduction of Nancy Guthrie is not your standard true crime narrative of a burglary gone horribly wrong. It is a tragically common narrative in law enforcement where property crimes rapidly spiral into severe personal assaults. The officers meticulously processed the blood evidence and carefully documented the scattered belongings, attempting to build a preliminary profile of a panicked, disorganized intruder who lashed out in fear. They cordoned off the affluent street, brought in crime scene technicians to swab the droplets on the porch, and began the arduous process of canvassing the sprawling neighborhood for any witnesses who might have heard a scream or seen a speeding vehicle fleeing into the night. They believed they were hunting a reckless, desperate criminal who had made a catastrophic error in judgment and left behind a messy, chaotic trail of physical clues. The entire initial investigative posture was completely built around the theory of a chaotic, botched home invasion. The local police thought they were dealing with an ordinary, albeit brutal, localized crime. They were thoroughly convinced that the messy physical evidence left at the scene would quickly point them toward a known local offender with a history of property crimes. It is a chilling masterclass in targeted infiltration. They operated under this standard assumption for hours, methodically bagging evidence and securing the perimeter. They firmly believed that they understood the basic parameters of the violence they were investigating. They thought they had the narrative figured out right up until the exact moment they finally managed to extract the digital data from the house's compromised security system and actually watched the recovered doorbell camera footage. They thought they were hunting a panicked burglar, but when they hit play on that recovered video file, they found themselves staring at an image that completely destroyed every single assumption they had made about the crime scene. They realized they were not dealing with a disorganized thief. They were dealing with something far more calculated and infinitely more dangerous. The silent footage changed everything permanently. The released video clip is incredibly brief, but it possesses a deeply chilling quality that immediately forces a massive reevaluation of the entire threat matrix. The footage clearly displays a suspect deliberately approaching the residence under the cover of darkness.